On September 1st, 1994, the body of an 11-year-old boy was found under a railroad viaduct on Chicago's South Side. 2 bullets to the back of the head, execution style. The boy's name was Robert Sandifer, but everyone in the Roseland neighborhood knew him as Yummy, a nickname he got because of his love of cookies and candy. He was small for his age. He had a baby face that made him look younger than 11. He liked sweets the way any child does. He was also a documented gang member, a suspected murderer, and a fugitive from Chicago police who had been hunting him for 2 weeks following the death of a 14-year-old girl named Siobhan Dean, killed by a stray bullet that investigators believed came from Yummy's gun. When his photo appeared on the cover of Time magazine on September 19, 1994, America stopped cold. Not because of what he had done, but because of what he looked like. A baby face staring back from the cover of the country's most prominent news magazine, representing not just his own story, but a question that an entire nation suddenly couldn't avoid. How does an 11-year-old boy end up here? The answer to that question is not simple. It is not comfortable. And it implicates not just a gang, not just a neighborhood, not just a city, but a country that had made a series of deliberate choices about which children mattered and which ones didn't. This is the story of Yummy Sandifer, and it is one of the saddest things we have ever covered on this channel. To understand Yummy Sandifer's story, you have to understand Roseland, the Southside Chicago neighborhood where he was born, where he lived, and where he died. Because place shapes destiny in ways that comfortable America has never fully wanted to acknowledge. Roseland in the 1980s and early 1990s was a neighborhood in the advanced stages of the same collapse that had taken down Black communities across the industrial Midwest. It had once been a working-class community with genuine stability, manufacturing jobs, intact families, neighborhood institutions. The steel mills and factories that had anchored the South Side's economy employed generations of Black workers who had come up from the South during the Great Migration, chasing something better than what they'd left behind. And then the plants closed, the jobs left, the disinvestment accelerated. White flight had already hollowed out the tax base. Now the economic foundation crumbled entirely. What remained in Roseland by the time Robert Sandifer was born in 1983 was a neighborhood of concentrated multi-generational poverty with deteriorating housing, failing schools, minimal city services, and an unemployment rate that made the formal economy feel like something happening in a different country entirely. Into that vacuum, as it always does, came the gang economy. The Black disciples, the gangster disciples, the vice lords. Chicago's South Side was carved into territories controlled by organizations that provided the economic activity, the social structure, and the sense of belonging that every other institution had stopped providing. For children growing up in Roseland, the gang wasn't an outside force that invaded their world. It was woven into the world they were born into. It was the older boys on the corner. It was the structure that determined who was safe and who wasn't on which block. It was, in a devastatingly literal sense, the most visible and functional organization in the neighborhood. Robert Sandifer was born into that world, and before he was old enough to fully understand what any of it meant, that world had already begun consuming him. Yummy's home life was, by every documented account, a catastrophe from the beginning. His mother, Lorena Sandifer, was herself a product of the same cycles of poverty, trauma, and dysfunction that would later consume her son. She had Robert when she was a teenager. She struggled with addiction. She was, by the assessment of child welfare investigators who eventually became heavily involved in the family, unable to provide the basic care and supervision that children require. His father was largely absent. Robert was one of multiple children in a household that was chaotic, unstable, and frequently dangerous. The Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, was involved with the Sandifer family repeatedly during Robert's early years. Investigators documented evidence of physical abuse. There were burns on his body. There were signs of neglect so severe that it crossed into cruelty. He was eventually removed from his mother's home and placed with his grandmother, Janie Fields. His grandmother was not a villain in this story. She was an older woman trying to manage a household full of grandchildren, doing what she could with what she had, which was not enough to meet what Robert needed. By the time Robert Sandifer was entering elementary school, his trajectory had already been shaped by forces that would have challenged the most resilient child: abuse, neglect, instability, the absence of consistent, nurturing adult attachment that child development research consistently identifies as foundational to healthy development. He was also, by multiple accounts, a child who was simultaneously tough and vulnerable, who could be sweet and was genuinely loved by people in his neighborhood, who liked candy and junk food and had a smile that had earned him his nickname, and who had been failed systematically and completely by every adult institution that should have caught him before he fell. Here is one of the most damning threads in the entire Yummy Sandifer story. By the time he was 11 years old, Robert Sandifer had been arrested more than 24 times. Read that again. More than 24 arrests. Before his 12th birthday. The charges ranged across armed robbery, car theft, burglary, and various other offenses. He had a documented criminal history that was extraordinary for a child his age. He was known to police, known to the courts, known to the juvenile justice system. And what did that system do with him? It cycled him, arrested him, processed him, placed him in juvenile facilities or back with his grandmother and released him over and over, without anything resembling the intensive intervention, the therapeutic support, the trauma-informed care, the genuine stabilization that a child with his history required. The Illinois juvenile justice system in this era was not equipped, funded, or philosophically oriented toward the kind of intervention that might have altered Robert Sandifer's path. It was a processing system, a revolving door. It saw a troubled child and responded with the only tools it reliably had: detention and release, rather than the tools that might have actually helped. Child welfare advocates who later examined Yummy's case pointed to multiple specific moments where a different intervention might have changed the outcome. Moments where the right placement, the right therapeutic relationship, the right adult attention might have given this child something to hold on to. Those moments passed without the right response, every time. The system knew Robert Sandifer existed. It touched his life repeatedly, and it failed him repeatedly, which means it also ultimately failed Siobhan Dean, the 14-year-old girl who died. By the time he was 10 and 11 years old, Yummy Sandifer had been fully absorbed into the Black Disciple street gang operating in Roseland. The gang's interest in Robert was not accidental, and it was not benign. Children his age occupied a specific and calculated role in the gang economy. They could be used to carry weapons, to run errands, to commit crimes, because the juvenile justice system's consequences for children were dramatically less severe than those for adults. A 10-year-old caught with a gun faced fundamentally different legal exposure than an 18-year-old. The adults in the gang knew this. They used it deliberately. For Robert, the gang offered something that almost nothing else in his life had provided: belonging, structure, a sense of being seen and valued, however twisted the terms of that valuing. The older members gave him attention, gave him a role, gave him identity. For a child who had been abused, neglected, and cycled through a failing system, that was not nothing. It was, in a heartbreaking way, almost everything. He was given a gun, he was given assignments, he was, by every subsequent account of what happened, being used by adults who understood exactly what they were doing and felt no apparent concern about what it would cost this child. In late August 1994, Robert Sandifer fired shots in a Roseland alley. The intended target was a rival gang member. The bullet that killed Siobhan Dean was not aimed at her. She was 14 years old, standing in the wrong place, and she was gone. After Siobhan Dean was killed, Chicago police launched a manhunt for Robert Sandifer. His face was on the news. His name was in the papers. An 11-year-old boy was the subject of a citywide search. For 2 weeks, Yummy moved through Roseland, hidden by various community members trying to stay ahead of the police. The accounts of those 2 weeks describe a child who was frightened, genuinely, recognizably frightened in the way that children are frightened. underneath whatever hardness the streets had built around him. He was, in those 2 weeks, still 11 years old, still small, still, in the most fundamental sense, a child in a situation that no child should ever be in. The Black Disciples' leadership, meanwhile, was calculating. Yummy had become a liability. His face was everywhere. The police pressure his fugitive status was generating was bad for business. The adults who had handed him a gun and pointed him at targets were now looking at this 11-year-old boy and seeing a problem that needed solving. On the night of September 1st, 1994, Yummy Sandifer was lured to the viaduct on South Cottage Grove Avenue by two teenage members of the Black Disciples, Derek and Craig Hardaway, 16 and 14 years old, respectively. They shot him twice in the back of the head and left his body where it was found the next morning. The adults who ordered it sent children to do it because, again, the juvenile justice consequences were more manageable. Robert Yummy Sandifer, age 11, was murdered by the organization that had recruited him, used him, and discarded him when he became inconvenient. When Time magazine put Yummy's face on its cover 2 weeks after his death, the reaction across America was immediate and intense. His baby face, the round cheeks, the child's features, made viscerally undeniable something that statistics and policy debates had allowed people to keep abstract. This was a child. This was what was happening to children in America's abandoned urban neighborhoods. This was the human face of decisions that had been made in city halls, state legislatures, and the halls of Congress about which communities deserved investment and which ones could be written off. The debate that erupted in the wake of Yummy's death was fierce and often uncomfortable. Some commentators focused on personal responsibility, on the choices made by his mother, his family, the gang members who used him. Others focused on systemic failures, the poverty, the disinvestment, the collapse of the child welfare and juvenile justice systems that had touched Robert Sandifer's life dozens of times without helping him. The most honest voices acknowledged that both things were true simultaneously, that personal choices and systemic conditions are not competing explanations. They operate together, with systemic conditions shaping the range of choices available to individuals in profound and often determinative ways. A child born into Robert Sandifer's circumstances, the abuse, the neglect, the multi-generational poverty, the neighborhood stripped of economic opportunity, the gang economy filling every vacuum, was not guaranteed to end up where he ended up. But he was operating with a drastically reduced margin for error, with far fewer resources for resilience, with far fewer adults and institutions capable of catching him when he fell. America looked at Yummy Sandifer's face on that magazine cover and for a moment could not look away from what it had produced. Derek and Craig Hardaway, the teenage brothers who shot Yummy, were themselves children, 16 and 14 years old, products of the same Roseland environment, the same gang culture, the same institutional failures. They were tried and convicted. Derek Hardaway received a sentence of 45 years. Craig received a shorter sentence as the younger of the two. Their story adds another layer to the tragedy that is almost unbearable to sit with. Children murdering a child on the orders of adults who faced no comparable accountability. The adults who directed the killing, who made the organizational decision that Yummy needed to be eliminated and sent two teenagers to do it, faced significantly less direct legal consequence for that specific act than the boys who carried it out. The gang hierarchy that created this entire situation, that handed a gun to an 11-year-old and used him as a criminal instrument, and then ordered his murder when he became inconvenient, that hierarchy continued operating. Robert Yummy Sandifer's story is unique in this documentary series in one important way. Every other figure we've covered, however sympathetically we've contextualized their circumstances, was an adult who made adult choices with adult awareness of consequences. Yummy was 11 years old. He was a child who was abused before he could form coherent memories, who was failed by parents, by child welfare systems, by schools, by juvenile justice, by every institution that existed specifically to catch children before they fell into exactly the place he fell. who was then recruited, used, and murdered by adults who saw his childhood as a resource to be exploited and a liability to be disposed of. He also contributed to Chevon Dean's death. That is real. Her family's grief is real. The two things coexist. The victimization of Robert Sandifer and the tragedy of Chevon Dean without canceling each other out. But the primary moral weight of what happened in Roseland in August and September of 1994 does not rest on an 11-year-old boy. It rests on the adults who abused him, the adults who neglected him, the systems that cycled him without helping him, the gang that recruited and used him, and the broader political and economic decisions that created and maintained the conditions in which all of it became possible. Yummy Sandifer didn't fail America. America failed Yummy Sandifer. And then it put his face on a magazine cover and called it a moment of national reflection. The reflection should have lasted longer, should have gone deeper, should have produced more than it did. In the neighborhoods that look like Roseland, and there are many of them in every major American city, children are still being failed in the same ways, still being abused and neglected and cycled through inadequate systems, still being recruited by gangs that see their vulnerability as utility, still dying before they've had a real chance to live. Yummy's face on that magazine cover was a question. 30 years later, America is still working on the answer. Robert Yummy Sandifer is buried in Burr Oak Cemetery in Chicago. He was 11 years old. He liked cookies and candy. He had a smile that earned him a nickname before he was old enough to understand what the world was going to ask of him. He deserved better. From his family, from his city, from his country. They all let him down, every single one. And somewhere in Chicago right now, there is a child in circumstances not entirely different from his, waiting to see whether this time, this generation, America finally decides to mean it when it says every child matters. Not just the ones on the covers of magazines, all of them. This one was heavy. If it moved you, hit like and subscribe, and drop in the comments, what do you think needs to change to prevent stories like Yummy's from repeating? Let's have that conversation.